The tall glass windows of the mansion let in the soft morning light, but the house still felt cold and empty. In the middle of this grand home lived a man who had everything money could buy, yet every night and every morning reminded him of the one thing he had lost: peace of mind. His name was Adrian, a billionaire known in the business world for his sharp mind and unshakable discipline. People feared his decisions, admired his success, and envied his life. But behind the polished suits and the long boardroom tables, Adrian was now just a single father trying to raise his infant son, Daniel. It had only been a year since his life had taken a sharp turn. His wife, the woman he thought would always stand by him, was gone. The reasons didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Daniel was left in his care, and Adrian, with all his resources, had no idea how to handle the little boy's cries, his sleepless nights, or his tiny fragile needs. Business contracts worth millions were easy for him to negotiate, but soothing his baby when he cried at 3 in the morning was something that left him helpless. The nights were the hardest. Adrian would walk the long hallways of his mansion, carrying Daniel in his arms, whispering softly, trying to comfort him. Sometimes he would stand by the crib for hours, rocking the baby gently, hoping he would sleep. But Daniel would fuss, and Adrian, exhausted after a day of meetings and endless calls, would feel a heavy wave of frustration mixed with guilt. He wanted to be strong for his son, but he often wondered if he was failing him. Every corner of the mansion reminded him of loneliness. The large dining table was always set by the staff, but he usually ate alone, sometimes with Daniel strapped to his chest. The once lively house that echoed with laughter now felt like a hollow shell. Adrian's wealth couldn't bring him comfort. He had tried everything: hiring expensive baby nurses, listening to expert advice, reading countless books on parenting, but none of it gave him the real connection he needed with his child. Still, he was determined. He promised himself that no matter how hard it became, he wouldn't abandon his son. If that meant sleepless nights and endless exhaustion, then so be it. Adrian had built empires with his bare hands, and he believed he could build a life for his son as well. Yet, deep down, he knew he couldn't do it alone. One evening, after a particularly long day, Adrian returned home from his office. His tie hung loose, his eyes looked tired, and his steps dragged. The sound of Daniel crying reached him before he even reached the nursery. He rushed upstairs, trying to calm his child, but Daniel cried harder. He warmed the bottle, but the baby refused it. Adrian's chest tightened. He held his son close, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. I'm here." But Daniel only wailed louder, his tiny fists trembling. By the time the child finally fell asleep from exhaustion, Adrian sat in the nursery chair, holding him close, feeling completely drained. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself that money couldn't solve this problem. His son didn't need another expensive toy or the latest stroller. He needed care, love, and someone who could give him the constant attention Adrian wasn't able to provide while managing an empire. That night, as the mansion finally grew quiet, Adrian stared at the ceiling, wrestling with his pride. He had always believed he could handle everything by himself. Accepting help felt like weakness. But this was different. This was his son's life. The baby deserved better than an exhausted father stumbling through sleepless nights. The next morning, one of his closest friends visited. Over coffee, Adrian's friend noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the way he could barely focus. He told him gently, "Adrian, you need help. Not just for you but for Daniel. You can't run your empire and raise him alone. It's too much for one man." Adrian didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, watching the gardens that stretched across his estate. He hated the idea of letting someone else into his private life, into his son's life. But deep inside, he knew his friend was right. After a long silence, he nodded slightly. "Maybe you're right. But I need someone I can trust. Someone who doesn't see my money first but sees Daniel." That single thought stayed with him for days. He wanted someone who cared genuinely, someone who wouldn't treat Daniel as just another job. But finding such a person felt impossible. Adrian didn't want strangers walking in and out of his son's life. He wanted stability, warmth, and loyalty. The following week, his friend returned with a recommendation. A woman who had worked as a nanny for several families, someone known for her patience, honesty, and gentle nature. At first, Adrian shook his head. "I don't think anyone can do this right," he said stubbornly. But when the sleepless nights returned and Daniel's cries echoed louder in the empty house, Adrian finally agreed to at least meet her. That decision would soon change everything, though Adrian had no idea of it yet. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with uncertainty. Adrian tried convincing himself that he didn't need her, that he could manage. But as he sat in his office late at night, papers scattered across his desk, and the faint sound of Daniel crying from the monitor, he realized this wasn't about him anymore. It was about giving his son the love and care he deserved. So, for the first time since his wife had left, Adrian opened his guarded heart to the idea of letting someone else step in. He didn't know what to expect, didn't know how this new chapter would unfold, but a small spark of hope flickered inside him. Maybe, just maybe, help was on the way. The day of the meeting arrived, and Adrian tried to push away the doubts in his mind. He stood in the grand living room of his mansion, his arms crossed, watching the morning light spill through the tall windows. The sound of Daniel's soft giggles came from the nursery upstairs, and for a moment, Adrian felt torn. A part of him still whispered that he didn't need help, that he could manage if he just tried harder. But another part of him, the tired father who had walked through too many sleepless nights, knew he had to give this a chance. The doorbell rang, sharp and clear, cutting through his thoughts. Adrian's chest tightened as he walked to the door. He opened it slowly, his eyes falling on a woman standing calmly with a small bag in her hand. She was dressed modestly, her eyes warm yet steady. There was something about her presence that felt different. She didn't look intimidated by the mansion's size or overwhelmed by its luxury. She simply stood there with quiet confidence, as though she had come not to be impressed, but to do her duty. "Mr. Adrian," she asked gently. He gave a short nod. "Yes. You must be Miss Grace." She smiled, and the expression lit up her face. "Yes, sir. Thank you for meeting me." Adrian stepped aside and let her in. He noticed how she looked around briefly, not with awe, but with observation, as though she were already measuring the space for the comfort of the child she might care for. There was no sign of nervousness, no attempt to flatter him, and for some reason, that steadiness caught Adrian off guard. They sat in the living room, and Adrian explained the routines, his expectations, and his worries. Grace listened carefully, not interrupting, her eyes attentive and filled with a calm assurance. When he finished, she spoke softly. "Children need more than food and sleep. They need to feel safe, they need love, and they need someone who is present. If you hire me, I will do more than just watch him. I will care for him as though he were my own." Her words lingered in the air. Adrian didn't respond right away. He was used to people offering promises, but something about the way she spoke felt different. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't exaggerated, it was simple and true. Just then, Daniel's cries echoed from upstairs. Adrian shifted uncomfortably, half ready to excuse himself, but before he could stand, Grace said gently, "May I?" For a moment, Adrian hesitated. Letting a stranger near his son felt unnatural. But something in her eyes reassured him, and he nodded slowly. Grace stood and followed the sound of the cries to the nursery. Adrian trailed behind, his chest tight with uncertainty. When they entered the room, Daniel was squirming in his crib, his face red with distress. Adrian instinctively reached forward, but Grace was already leaning over the crib. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic. She picked him up with practiced hands, cradling him against her chest. Daniel fussed for a moment longer, then, as she began humming a quiet lullaby, his cries softened into whimpers. Within minutes, his tiny body relaxed, and his eyes began to close. Adrian stood frozen, watching with disbelief. He had spent countless nights trying and failing to calm his son, and now, in just a few minutes, this woman had done what he could not. His heart clenched not with jealousy, but with something he couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps. Or gratitude. Or both. Grace continued humming, swaying gently with Daniel in her arms. She didn't rush, didn't look up for approval, didn't even seem to notice Adrian's astonishment. She was fully present with the child, her touch and voice radiating comfort. When Daniel finally fell asleep, she placed him back in the crib with such tenderness that Adrian felt an ache in his chest. He cleared his throat quietly. He usually cries for hours. Grace turned to him and gave a small smile. Babies cry when they feel unsettled. They sense everything, the tension in the air, the emotions around them. Sometimes all they need is warmth and patience. Adrian looked at her closely, and for the first time in many months, he felt a sense of hope stirring inside him. The rest of the day passed with Grace spending time around the house, learning Daniel's routine, speaking softly to him, and adjusting to the new environment. Adrian found himself observing her from a distance. He noticed how she carried Daniel with ease, how she spoke to him even when he couldn't understand, and how she treated every small task, feeding, changing, rocking with gentle dedication. Later in the evening, Adrian stood at the doorway of the nursery, watching as Grace held Daniel in her arms, feeding him a bottle. The baby's eyes gazed up at her with quiet trust, his little hands clutching the edge of the blanket. Adrian's chest tightened again. There was something almost sacred in that simple moment, his child safe and content in the arms of someone who truly cared. For years, Adrian had built walls around himself. Money, power, control, these were his shields against the unpredictable. But now, watching this woman hum softly as she fed his son, he felt those walls shift just a little. It was unsettling and comforting all at once. When Grace finally handed Daniel back to him, she said gently, "He knows you're his father. He feels your love, even when you don't think you're doing enough." The words struck him deeply. Adrian held his son close, feeling a lump rise in his throat. No one had spoken to him like that in a long time. No one had looked past his wealth and seen the man struggling beneath it. That night, for the first time in months, Daniel slept soundly. And Adrian, standing in the quiet of the nursery, realized something had changed. The mansion didn't feel quite as empty anymore. He didn't know what the future held, or how this new arrangement would unfold. But he knew one thing for certain: something unexpected had begun the moment Grace walked into his home. The weeks passed, and the mansion began to feel alive again. Daniel was thriving under Grace's care. His once restless nights were now filled with steady sleep, and his days were brighter with laughter and joy. The little boy, who used to cry endlessly, now reached out with eager hands whenever Grace entered the room. She had become not only a caretaker but a source of comfort and stability that Adrian could not ignore. Adrian watched all of this quietly, often from a distance. At first, he had been reluctant to allow anyone so close to his son, but now, he could see the difference Grace had made. Yet with every moment of peace she brought, another battle began inside him. Adrian was not a man who trusted easily. He had built his empire by being cautious, by questioning motives, and by never allowing anyone too much power over his life. Allowing Grace into his home had been difficult enough, but allowing her into his heart was something he had not prepared for. The first signs of conflict came from outside, from the world Adrian was used to controlling. One evening, he hosted a dinner with several business partners at his mansion. As usual, the dining table gleamed with silverware, and the chandeliers lit the room in golden light. Grace moved quietly in the background, carrying Daniel before placing him gently in his crib upstairs. But her presence did not go unnoticed. One of Adrian's associates, a sharp-tongued man with more pride than kindness, leaned closer during dinner and whispered with a smirk, "I see you've hired help. Doesn't really fit the picture, does it? A billionaire with, well, someone like her raising your child." The words were meant as a joke, but they carried a sting. Adrian's jaw tightened, and though he gave no reply, his eyes hardened. He excused himself from the table and walked to the nursery, where Grace sat beside Daniel's crib, humming softly. The peace in that room stood in stark contrast to the shallow whispers downstairs. For a moment, Adrian just stood in the doorway, watching. He wanted to forget the comments, but they stayed in his mind like a thorn. Grace, unaware of what had been said, smiled at him. "He's sleeping soundly tonight," she whispered. Adrian forced a nod, but his thoughts lingered elsewhere. As the days went on, the tension grew. Some of Adrian's friends and business associates didn't understand why he had hired Grace, and they made subtle remarks. To them, appearances mattered, and the image of a billionaire father with a nanny who came from a modest background didn't match the perfect picture they thought he should maintain. Adrian struggled with these whispers. On one hand, he didn't care what people thought. He had never let gossip dictate his choices before. On the other hand, he knew the world he lived in was full of judgment and scrutiny. He feared what those whispers could mean for Daniel in the future. He worried that perhaps people would look down on his son, or that the gossip would grow into something larger. But inside the mansion, life told a different story. Grace continued to nurture Daniel with unwavering patience. She read him stories in the afternoons, her gentle voice filling the nursery with warmth. She laughed with him, teaching him to clap his hands and wave. She noticed the little things like the way he liked to be rocked before sleep or how he preferred a certain blanket when restless. Adrian began to notice the changes in himself too. He found that he was spending more time at home, drawn to the warmth Grace and Daniel shared. Instead of late nights at the office, he would return earlier, just to see his son's eyes light up. He often found himself standing quietly near the doorway, watching Grace play with Daniel on the floor. Her laughter was soft but full of life, and Daniel's squeals of joy filled the once empty halls. Still, the inner battle raged on. Adrian had grown up in a world of status and control. Letting Grace into this world felt like exposing a part of himself he had kept locked away. He admired her strength, her patience, and the way she brought peace to his son's life. But he also feared it. He feared relying on someone so deeply, feared that one day she might leave, and the quiet stability would vanish. One afternoon, as Adrian sat in his office, Grace knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Adrian, may I speak with you?" He looked up from his papers, surprised. "Of course. Come in." Grace stepped in, her hands folded. "I've noticed Daniel is responding well to a more structured routine. He's calmer when he eats and sleeps at the same times each day. I was wondering if you'd like to join in more during these times. It could help him bond with you even more." Her words struck him differently than she intended. On the surface, it was a simple suggestion. But to Adrian, it felt like she was challenging him to open up more, to let go of his rigid ways and embrace fatherhood more fully. For a moment, his pride bristled. Did she think he wasn't doing enough? Did she see him as a failure? He leaned back in his chair, his voice a little too sharp. "I think I know what's best for my son." Grace's eyes softened, but she didn't back down. "I know you love him, sir. But sometimes love is shown in the smallest moments, not just in providing. He doesn't care about your wealth. He only knows your presence." Her words hung heavy in the air. Adrian felt a rush of emotions: anger at being told something so direct, but also a sting of truth he couldn't deny. He dismissed her gently, but for the rest of the night, her words echoed in his mind. Later, as he stood by Daniel's crib watching his son sleep, he thought about what Grace had said. She was right. He had been so focused on providing for his son's future that he had overlooked the importance of being present in his son's now. The next evening, instead of hiding behind work, Adrian joined Grace in the nursery during Daniel's bedtime. She handed him the bottle, guiding him patiently on how to hold the baby so he felt secure. At first, Adrian's hands trembled with uncertainty, but as Daniel's small eyes gazed up at him, the tension melted away. For the first time, Adrian felt a connection deeper than duty. It was pure love. Grace smiled quietly, stepping back to give them space. In that moment, Adrian realized that the barriers between their worlds, wealth, status, background, mattered far less than the bond they were building together with Daniel. Yet, even as this realization grew, he knew the world outside would not understand. There would be more whispers, more doubts, and more judgment. But as he held his son close, feeling Daniel's tiny hand curl around his finger, Adrian made a silent promise. He would protect this bond, no matter what. And though he didn't admit it aloud, he also knew this: Grace was no longer just a nanny. She was becoming something far more important, something he could not ignore, no matter how much his pride told him to resist. The rain fell hard against the mansion windows one evening, the storm outside shaking the trees and rattling the glass. Inside, the house was warm and calm, but that peace shattered when Daniel's cries suddenly pierced the air. At first, Adrian thought it was the usual fussing, the kind that could be soothed with a soft lullaby or a bottle. But when he rushed upstairs and saw his son's flushed face and trembling body, fear unlike anything he had ever felt gripped him. Grace was already in the nursery, her arms gently wrapped around the baby. Daniel's skin was hot, his little breaths shallow. Adrian's heart pounded as panic clouded his mind. He was a man who always had answers in the business world, yet here he stood, helpless in front of his sick child. "What's wrong with him?" Adrian asked, his voice sharp with fear. Grace looked calm, though worry flickered in her eyes. "He has a fever," she said softly. "It came on suddenly. We need to act quickly, but stay calm. Babies often get fevers, and panic will only make it harder." Adrian's hands shook as he reached for his phone, already scrolling for emergency numbers, but Grace placed a steady hand on his arm. "Let me handle this first. Please trust me." For a moment, Adrian wanted to argue. He wanted to call the doctor immediately, demand someone rush to the mansion, throw money at the problem like he always did. But as he looked at Grace's steady expression, a strange sense of reassurance washed over him. He stepped back, his chest tight, and let her take the lead. Grace carried Daniel to the bathroom and began running lukewarm water in the sink. She dampened a soft cloth and gently placed it on the baby's forehead, humming softly all the while. Adrian followed closely, his eyes never leaving his son. His mind screamed with worry, but he could not ignore the way Daniel's cries slowly softened under Grace's calm presence. "Stay with me, little one," she whispered, rocking him gently. "You're strong, you'll be fine." Adrian had never felt so powerless. He wanted to fix this, but all he could do was watch as Grace soothed his son. Her patience, her steady rhythm, and her quiet words filled the room with calmness. It was as if her presence created a shield of peace that even the storm outside could not break. After some time, she turned to Adrian. "The fever is high, but it's not dangerous yet. I've seen this many times. We'll keep him cool and hydrated. If it doesn't drop within the hour, we'll call the doctor." Adrian nodded stiffly, his throat dry. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clenched. Every minute felt like an eternity. He watched Grace cradle Daniel, whispering soothing words, her cheek pressed gently against the baby's hair. In that moment, Adrian saw her in a different light. She wasn't just a nanny taking care of his son, she was a guardian, a calm protector who stood strong where he faltered. He realized how much he had come to depend on her without even knowing it. The fever lingered, but slowly, under Grace's care, Daniel's body began to relax. His breathing grew steadier, and his cries turned into soft whimpers. Adrian exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Grace looked at him, her eyes gentle. "You don't have to thank me, sir. He's your son. I'm just here to help." But Adrian shook his head. "No, you're more than that." His eyes glistened with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "I thought I could do this alone. I thought being strong meant not needing anyone. But tonight, I realized. I can't. Not without you." For a moment, the room was quiet except for the sound of the storm outside. Grace didn't answer right away, but her expression softened, touched by the honesty in his voice. She placed Daniel gently back in his crib, tucking him in with careful hands. Adrian stood beside her, looking down at his son. "I was afraid to let you in," he admitted quietly. "Afraid of what people would say, afraid of needing someone too much. But when I saw you holding him tonight, when I saw the way you calmed him, I realized that what others think doesn't matter. What matters is that he's safe, that he's loved. And you've given him that." Grace lowered her gaze, humbled. "All children need love, sir. Daniel just needed someone to feel close to. That's why I'm here." Adrian turned to her then, his eyes filled with gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt his guard drop completely. This woman had not only cared for his son but had reached a part of him he thought was lost forever. She had reminded him what it meant to trust, to lean on someone, and to let love in. The storm outside eventually calmed, and the house grew quiet again. Adrian sat in the nursery long after Daniel had fallen asleep, watching over him with Grace by his side. He realized that the bond forming between them was no longer just about duty. It was about something deeper, something unexpected. As the night stretched on, Adrian looked at Grace and whispered, "You've become part of this family. Whether you realize it or not." Grace didn't reply right away, but the look in her eyes said enough. She had come into the mansion as an employee, but now, she was something far more. From that night forward, things changed between them. Adrian no longer saw her as someone from a different world. He saw her as someone who belonged, someone whose presence brought warmth and strength where he had only felt emptiness before. And though he didn't know what the future would bring, he knew one truth for certain: the unexpected bond that had formed in the quiet of the storm was something he could never let go. The days after the storm felt different inside the mansion. The air no longer carried the same heavy silence that had once filled every room. Instead, there was warmth, laughter, and the gentle rhythm of daily life. Daniel was healthier and happier, his giggles echoing through the wide halls. Adrian noticed how even the staff, who had always been polite but distant, seemed lighter now. Grace had brought something into the house that money could never buy: peace. Adrian began to see the changes not just in Daniel but in himself. He was no longer rushing to hide behind his work, no longer escaping into endless meetings. Every evening, he found himself drawn back home earlier, eager to sit with his son, eager to share the small moments that once seemed unimportant. He noticed how Daniel's eyes sparkled whenever Grace entered the room, how his tiny hands reached for her with pure trust. And instead of feeling replaced, Adrian felt grateful. He knew now that the love she gave his son was the very thing Daniel needed most. Yet the outside world continued to whisper. At business gatherings and social events, Adrian could feel the unspoken questions in the air. Some people tried to be subtle, others less so. They wanted to know why a billionaire had allowed someone from such a different background to become so important in his private life. At first, Adrian ignored it. But one evening, At a high-profile event, a man asked bluntly, "Adrian, with all your wealth, why choose her? Surely you could afford someone more fitting." The word stung, not because Adrian doubted his choice, but because he realized how shallow the world around him could be. He gave the man a hard look and said with quiet strength, "Because she gives my son something money can't buy. She gives him love. And that is worth more than anything in this room." The room fell silent, and no one dared to question him again. That night, Adrian returned home and found Grace in the nursery, reading softly to Daniel. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the scene with pride. The judgment of others no longer mattered. What mattered was here his son, safe and loved, and the woman who had given both of them a new reason to hope. As weeks turned into months, the bond between Adrian, Daniel, and Grace grew stronger. Grace never treated her role as just a job. She cooked simple meals for Daniel with care, she kept the nursery filled with small handmade touches, and she spoke to him as though every word mattered. Adrian often found himself drawn into these moments. Sometimes, Grace would laugh when she caught him standing quietly nearby, watching them play. "You're welcome to join us, you know," she would tease gently. Adrian would smile faintly, sit down, and soon find himself laughing along with them. The walls he had built around himself were slowly falling, brick by brick, without him even noticing. One afternoon, Daniel took his first steps in the living room. Grace clapped her hands with excitement, encouraging him forward. Adrian, who had just returned from work, walked in just in time to see his son's tiny legs wobble across the floor. Daniel stumbled into his arms, and Adrian felt tears rise in his eyes. He looked up and saw Grace smiling proudly, her eyes shining. In that moment, Adrian realized she had given him something even greater than support. She had given him memories he would carry forever. That evening, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Adrian found Grace in the kitchen, tidying up. He paused, then spoke softly. "I don't think I've ever thanked you properly. Not just for caring for him, but for caring for me too, in ways you probably don't even realize." Grace looked surprised but smiled humbly. "I didn't do anything extraordinary, sir. I only gave what every child deserves: love and consistency. Daniel is the extraordinary one. He makes it easy." Adrian shook his head. "You don't see it, but you've changed everything. This house used to feel empty. I used to feel empty. But now," he trailed off, struggling to find words. Grace placed the dish towel down and met his gaze. "Sometimes the smallest acts of love fill the biggest emptiness. Maybe that's what Daniel was waiting for." Her words lingered in his heart long after she left the room. Over time, the mansion was no longer just a grand house, it became a home. The sound of Daniel's laughter, Grace's gentle songs, and Adrian's deeper laughter filled its halls. The staff, once formal, now shared in the warmth too. Meals became more joyful, the nights less lonely. Adrian realized that wealth could build walls and buy comfort, but it could never create the sense of family that now lived within his home. One quiet night, Adrian stood by Daniel's crib. The little boy slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling. Grace was seated nearby, humming softly as she finished folding some of his clothes. Adrian turned to her, his voice low but firm. "Grace. I don't know what I would have done without you. What happened when you came into our lives, it was unexpected. But it was exactly what we needed." Grace looked up, her expression calm yet touched. "Life often gives us what we need in the most surprising ways," she said simply. Adrian smiled faintly. He had once been afraid of needing someone, afraid of being vulnerable. But now, he understood that strength was not found in standing alone. It was found in allowing love to enter, even when it came from the most unexpected places. The story of the billionaire single dad and his nanny was not one of wealth or power, but of healing. Grace had stepped into their lives quietly, with no promises of riches or grand gestures. And yet, she had given them everything they truly needed: peace, love, and the sense of being whole again. As Adrian turned off the nursery light that night, he knew their journey together was just beginning. The world outside could whisper all it wanted, but inside this home, the truth was clear. Family was not defined by status or background. Family was built through love, sacrifice, and the willingness to care. And in the most unexpected way, Adrian, Daniel, and Grace had found exactly that.